Hi, I'm Jeremy Goldkorn for Danwei TV, sitting at the Stoneboat in Rushan Park with Paul French, who has just published his fourth book, Through the Looking Glass, China's Foreign Journalists from Opium Wars to Mao. Paul, welcome to Danwei TV. Can you tell us what is this book about?
Thanks, it's an honour. It's just simply a history of the foreign press in China, but really it's my attempt again to try and get away from history as abstract nouns, just class, gender, race, you know, the way we all learn history at school, and try and show the history of modern China through the eyes of a group of people. Really, in this case, the foreign journalists who came here from about the 1820s up until 1949.
From the 1820s up until 1949. So, what is the difference between the foreign press corps back then and now?
I mean, you know, there's no way of getting around it, but China was just a bigger story in those days, whatever way you look at it. I mean, you know, if you go back to the 1820s, China is roughly, you know, 30% of world GDP. Now it's about 11, so it was a bigger economic story. I mean, there's nothing now to compare to reporting on the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, or, you know, people write about trade disputes with the EU or Washington, but it's hardly the Opium Wars, you know. There's nothing really to compare with 1911, 1919, 1937, the start of the war. I mean, you know, the story was so much bigger, and China throughout that period was really just on the brink of collapse. And subsequently, what I was amazed to find out was that most of the world's major newspapers covered China in a lot more detail than they do now, and yet now we think China's a big story, but actually it's much less of a story in terms of column inches.
How did you get interested in this subject?
Well, I did the biography of Karl Crow, who had worked as a journalist, and I was very interested as a sideline on just how much he was being asked to write about China for foreign wire services. But also, of course, he was working on a newspaper in Shanghai, which was just one of these incredible newspapers like the China Press in Shanghai, the North China Daily News.
Sorry, what era was that?
Well, this was sort of from about 1911 to the Second World War. But there were all these newspapers, the Peking and Tianjin Times. These were major newspapers in English. There were also ones in French and Russian and German that were daily newspapers all up and down the China coast in the treaty ports. And of course, all of those are gone now. But they hired hundreds of journalists. You know, I mean, they first started in about the 1850s. They lasted through to about 1950. And all of those are gone now, with the exception of perhaps the South China Morning Post in Hong Kong. All of that China Coast press has gone. And yet it had the most amazing journalists who wrote some of the most amazing stories and who were some of the most amazing characters working on it.
So speaking of amazing characters, on the back of the book is a review from Melinda Liu, the Newsweek Beijing bureau chief. And she says, opium addicts, concubine, missionary, spy, Paul French brings to life the larger-than-life personalities of a bygone China foreign press corps. Can you tell us about an opium addict or a concubine? I'm not interested in talking about missionaries.
Okay, let's forget missionaries. And there aren't that many missionaries, so don't get too worried about it. There were one or two. Well, if you want an opium addict who was also a concubine, I mean, and one that a lot of people know, and I think is very interesting, then Emily Hahn is the one. And she came to Shanghai in the mid-1930s. And she already had a reputation, but she started writing for the New Yorker. And in the New Yorker, she wrote about the great swirl of expatriate life, Shanghai lander life, the late night parties, the drinking, the excesses of life at that time. But unlike just about every other journalist, she crossed over and actually became involved with the Chinese media. I mean, she was with her, I don't really know what to call him, her partner. She was not really she certainly wasn't his first wife. She set up a number of very avant-garde magazines in Shanghai.
Her partner was a Chinese
Zhao Xinmei, the poet, yes, who had been educated in England and France, and who came back with a lot of very avant-garde ideas and really conceptualized that whole East-West fusion that happened in Shanghai between the wars. And he was putting out these great, very well-designed and very literate magazines in Chinese that she was working on. And she became his concubine. And he also introduced her to the opium pipe, which she decided she rather liked. Stayed on it for quite a while, then decided she better get off it because it wasn't going to help her live a long time. Went through the horrors of withdrawing from opium and wrote probably her greatest piece ever, called The Big Smoke, which was run in the New Yorker, which is still reprinted quite often as a classic piece of journalism on China. So here was someone who lived the sort of fast and loose life of Shanghai treaty port life, but also crossed over and worked in that avant-garde Shanghai media. And I think, we don't get too many people like that nowadays. And, there she is roistering around at the time of the bombing of Shanghai in the late 1930s, 1937, and then she ends up in Hong Kong for the fall of Hong Kong. She's up in Chongqing interviewing Madame Chang and covering the Sung sisters. And at the same time she has these deep roots into that Chinese cultural life as well. And I think people like that are just fascinating. And we tend to forget the journalists. Journalists are always to an extent on the sidelines of history. We remember the generals and the politicians and the leaders of revolutions and things, and we tend to forget the journalists who were around them. And I think someone said journalism is the first edit of history, it's the first cut of history. So it's really useful to go back and see what these people wrote about these incredible times.
And from the sounds of Emily Hahn's life, modern life is rubbish.
Well, one could suggest so. She wandered around Shanghai with her pet gibbon, Mr. Mills, on her shoulder, which guaranteed her a rather startling entry anywhere, because this gibbon, if it wasn't wildly masturbating, was urinating all over everyone. She had to put little diapers on it eventually. If that wasn't enough, she used to answer the door occasionally completely naked without having any idea who was on the other side of the door. It could be someone come round to collect the money for the gas bill, or it could be some good friends of hers. These were extraordinary times. People go out now and interview all sorts of interesting people, but remember, at that time they would have gone out and interviewed a warlord, the Tiger of Mukden, or the Dog Meat General or something. Or they would have gone out and followed the occupation of Manchuria by the Japanese, or they would have gone out and reported on the Taiping Heavenly Kingdom, one of the maddest events in history. Guy considers himself to be the half-brother of Jesus Christ, leads an insurrection against the Qing dynasty. 20 million people end up dead after 15 years of civil war. It's just, it's just incredible to even think about. And these journalists that I've written about went out there, and this is the world that they were traveling around in. And the world was a lot less known. China was a lot less known. It always seemed to be on the brink of imminent collapse and just splitting up and breaking apart. And in that sense, what an incredibly big story it was at the time, which also meant that anyone who wanted to be a top-flight correspondent had to do some China time as well.
All right. Paul French, author of Through the Looking Glass, thank you very much for being on Danwei TV.
It's an honor.